Back taxes shouldn't ruin your life. And if you don't jump on this, they will. I don't want you to be like the lady that I met in 2021 who was in her 60s just getting out of prison and only being able to work at McDonald's because you don't have any other options. All right? So you want to make sure you get on this as soon as possible.
Welcome to the Tax Relief with Timalyn Bowens podcast. Are you behind on taxes? Is the IRS threatening you or your business? Are you overwhelmed and confused about how to resolve your tax issues? Let's join Timalyn as she explains your options and how she may be able to help. Timalyn Bowens is America's favorite EA.
Hey family, I'm glad to be back in the studio today for episode 14. Now, this episode we are going to kind of switch gears, but before I give you some down news, let me give you some good news. At the end of episode 13, I'll let you know that we are finally live on Apple Podcast. It has been a long wait. So if you are a person that loves iTunes, Apple Podcasts, make sure you go ahead and follow us on Tax Relief with Timalyn Bowens there on that platform. Okay? Now, let's go back, and I shouldn't say sad news because remember, back taxes shouldn't ruin your life. And if you're connected with me, it's likely we're not going to let them. But today I want to talk about innocent spouse tax relief. All right. So back in August, I took a poll. My parents had just celebrated 39 years of marriage, right? So everybody was sending their congratulations, and I was asking, should I write about taxes and marriage? Should I cover taxes and marriage on the podcast? And it was crazy with the overwhelming response of yes, you should. So I am going to cover some of the, marital bliss topics, but this is tax relief with Timalyn Bowen. So we have to get down to the bad and the ugly as well. All right. So I want to tell you about a lady that I worked with in 2021. She reached out to me because she was in her 60s. She had very limited income. I think at the time she was actually working at a McDonald's. Now, this was very different from the way her life had been 20 years prior, okay? Her former husband had run an insurance business. Well, her husband, sometimes the IRS looks at different tax returns. No biggie, right? They do it to everybody. And I guess I shouldn't say no biggie. No biggie for me. That may make you sweat and have heart palpitations. But, they thought it was just a routine audit. No big deal. Well, her husband actually passed away. All right. So her husband died. The IRS comes back and come to find out they had years of fraudulent returns. Lying on your tax return is a very, very serious matter. I don't care what social media guru you've heard say it. If your cousin knows a person, your uncle has a guy, do not understate your income on your tax return. Do not put deductions or credits that you aren't eligible for. Because what ended up happening with this lady is that she served prison time because of the fraudulent tax returns, and then it rolled into other things. Now, she didn't even work in the insurance business with him, but when you file a joint return with your spouse, you are jointly liable for everything that is on there. Now, had I met her, 15 years ago, before all of this went down, I would have been able to help her make a claim for innocent spouse relief. So I hope you never have to face that. But if you are in a situation where looks like your spouse may be doing some sketchy stuff on the tax return, you need to make sure that you listen to this episode. And if you need further help, make sure you reach out, okay? Because again, back taxes shouldn't ruin your life, but in this type of situation, it very much will. So, what is innocent spouse relief? Innocent spouse relief absolves, or I'll say alleviates, a spouse when they are connected with someone else on a tax return. When I say someone else, it has to be their spouse, or even if it's a former spouse, where additional tax, penalties, and interest have been assessed due to fraud or negligence. All right. Now, sometimes it's confused with injured spouse relief. An injured spouse is someone where their share of a tax refund has been taken to pay for like a federal government debt, back taxes, those kinds of things. So this is completely different. All right. I'll talk about injured spouse in a different episode. So as far as the innocent spouse relief, you one had to have filed that married filing joint return. Two, you have to reach out to the IRS and make sure that you file a specific form, which I'm going to go over later on in the episode. And then you have to prove that you weren't in on the fraud or negligence that took place and that you reasonably would not have known about it at the time you signed the return. All right. So when we look at fraud on a tax return and we look at the innocent spouse relief, an example of fraud is, as I mentioned, understated income. So let's say we have a business owner and the IRS figures out they haven't been reporting all of their income. That's one example of fraud. Creative deductions. You know, when, like I said, you have that uncle that has a guy that can get your tax liability way down, or maybe you never get a refund, but now they can. You want to make sure some things that, you know, I don't want to say tell a white lie because it's a major lie. If you know you don't own a home, but you have a lot of mortgage interest on Schedule A of your return, yeah, that's a creative deduction. If you know you didn't give to a charity, but now you have $15,000 in charitable contributions, that is fraud. Even if we look at people, let's say family members, and I'll say that borrow each other's children on a tax return. If you claim a child on your tax return that's not yours, that is tax fraud, okay? Now, on the other side, there's also negligence. So it would be considered negligent, and I'll say fraud too. Let's say that you want to apply for a home, okay? And instead of you putting all of your deductions that you're actually eligible for, you lose receipts and you're like, oh, no big deal, because you don't really care about how much income is reported this year as far as getting it down because you want to be approved for that mortgage. Well, that's tax fraud and mortgage fraud. If you realize that this has happened on your return after the fact, you can file for innocent spouse relief. Now, the form that you'll file is called Form 8857. And when you file this, there are a few things that you should know. One, as soon as that additional tax, interest, and penalties are assessed, that's when you need to fill out the form, okay? You have up to 2 years from the IRS initial attempt to collect that additional tax, penalties, and interest. When you fill it out, you also bear the burden of proving that you didn't know that any fraud took place. You also have the burden of proving that under reasonable circumstances, you wouldn't have known at that time. You see, when you submit this, this isn't going to be processed in 21 days like an e-filed tax return. It takes about 8 weeks to process. And when the IRS reviews your claim, they're going to contact your spouse Or if you're divorced, they're going to contact your former spouse. They're going to be given the opportunity to participate in this process and give their side of the story. So you can't just be upset with your ex and not want to pay part of the tax that was assessed, so you fill out the innocent spouse form. You're going to have to actually build your case, okay? Now, if the IRS decides to grant you innocent spouse relief, your response will let you know that, and they'll collect the additional tax only from your spouse. But the IRS can deny your claim if they find out you all were in cahoots together. Some examples are if you transferred a property from your spouse's name to your name to avoid taxes that way. If we find out that you both were working together to avoid paying a third-party creditor, that's also a reason why the IRS would deny this claim. Now, maybe you knew your spouse was into some sketchy stuff. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you were completely blindsided. It's a lot of information to take in and process. But remember, you have 2 years from their initial attempt to collect the money to file this form. Now, if you're still with that spouse, you took your vows for better or for worse, depending on how much the penalties and tax are, you may not be able to pay that all today. If that is you, you're a little bit past tax compliance, but it may still be worth attempting to do the guaranteed payment plan if prior to this year or years you have been tax compliant. If you want to give that a go, I'd recommend my ebook, Guaranteed Payment Plan. But if you think you have it on your own, best of wishes to you. Now, remember, back taxes shouldn't ruin your life. And if you don't jump on this, they will. I don't want you to be like the lady that I met in 2021 who is in her 60s, just getting out of prison and only being able to work at McDonald's because you don't have any other options. All right? So you want to make sure you get on this as soon as possible. If you need additional help, there's information in the show notes where you can reach out and see if we're a good fit to work on this together. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen today. I'd like to thank Jim Ray Consulting Services for helping me get this message out to you. I hope you found the information helpful. Did you know 1 in 50 people have a tax problem? Please share this episode with your friends and family because you never know who may need help. Again, thanks for listening. Hey, just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It provides a framework and possible solutions for solving your tax problems, but it is not legally binding. Please consult your tax professional regarding your specific tax situation.